Hey, everybody. Welcome. Glad you're here with us today. This is our noon stream. We're doing one of these. That's the new pattern. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Let's have a little chat here at noon. Glad you're with us. Glad you're with us. Let's do it.
Of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just it's a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
All righty, everybody. So glad that we can have yet another noon conversation. So the way this works is I give my opening remarks about whatever it is I happen to be thinking about or talking about today. While I'm doing that, I'm taking note of your questions that are coming in. Questions on Rumble in the form of Rumble rants, questions on the Rockfin in the form of Rockfin tips, questions on YouTube in the form of super chats. They're all coming in, and I'll be taking note of them. And then after I'm done with my opening remarks, then we do a roll call. We find out who is on the other side of the camera, who's watching. Always a very, very exciting moment to find out who it is who's watching. And these noon streams, more people in Europe, places like that, can watch it. That's kind of why we're doing this. We hit different audiences, different times of day. And then after that, I answer questions for the rest of the little bit. So if you got something you want me to talk about, if you got something that you would like the conversation to focus on, or something you want me to respond to or address to, send it my way. Get me talking about what is important to you. That's why we're here. Give me something to talk about in the second half of the show. So yeah, that's what we're doing. So I guess just a quick announcement. I can't announce it enough times because it is my focus right now. It is my absolute focus right now is on Dare to Win, A World Beyond Imperialism, the National Convention of the Center for Political Innovation. That is set to take place. It's happening in Portland, Oregon on December 2nd. The great news is that I just found out, I announced it last night, Garland Nixon is joining us. So it won't simply be, Scott Ritter. It won't simply be Jyoti Brar from the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, but the great Garland Nixon will be flying in for it as well. It's turning into an all-star gathering. David Rovix is going to play his music. Nick Brana, it sounds like, will be there from the People's Party. We are going to have quite a big event in Portland, Oregon, and we need to fill that auditorium. Folks in Portland are working hard to make sure that that event is full. So we need you there. We need you there. So if you can make a point of being there, that would be awesome. That would be great. If not, if you can donate, send a donation. Donate to the Portland Conference. If you can donate, that would be awesome. That would help us cover the costs, etc. It looks like we're going to have a good conference in Portland. Let me just text somebody and let them know I'm streaming, and I'll call them afterwards. Hold on. All right. Took care of that. But yeah, if you want to send us a donation to help us have the conference, that'd be great. If you just want to make a point of being there, that would be great. If you're a member of the Center for Political Innovation and you'd like to help out with the outreach, etc., we can use all the help we can get. We need a full mobilization to have a really great anti-imperialist rally to close out the year of 2023 with the Center for Political Innovation. Great music, great speeches, just a great event. So want to let folks know about that. So I'll get into my opening remarks as the questions come in for the second half. I recently published this book that you all are aware of, Letter to Bob Avakian. And this is, Bob Avakian is the leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party, which is a Maoist sect, a really small communist group, but very visible communist group that has gets a lot of attention, I guess, in the United States. It's one of the communist groups from the 1970s that still remains, as many others have faded away. And a lot in this book is me talking about the history of the communist movement in the United States, the Maoist groups that were aligned with China, etc. And one thing that you have to address when talking about communists in the United States, and especially for people my age and younger who are trying to figure all of this out and try to find out the details. One group of people in U.S. communist history, 60s and 70s, they come up pretty frequently. And that group is the Weather Underground, or the Weathermen. Are people familiar with them? I will never forget how I knew I was a member of the Workers' World Party, and there was a woman who was in the Workers' World Party who had a relative who was, lived in Chicago and was in certain Democratic Party circles. And I remember how I told my parents. I went home. I was a college student at the time that Barack Obama was running for president. And I told my parents, Barack Obama is friends with Bill Ayers, the founder of the Weather Underground organization, the 1970s, communist bombing organization. Barack Obama is friends with Bill Ayers, and that's going to come out during the election, and it's going to be a scandal. My family, they rolled their eyes and said, "That's crazy. Barack Obama never has nothing to do with some communist group in the 1970s that blew things up. He's not friends with Bill Ayers. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard." That's what they told me. I said, "Okay, we'll see." And then you'll remember in 2008, it broke, and it was all over the news that Barack Obama had lived in the same apartment building as Bill Ayers and had a friendly relationship with Bill Ayers. Bill Ayers is the son of a very, very, very wealthy family that owned the state monopoly power company in the city of Chicago. And when Bill Ayers was a young man, he was the leader of a group that went on a bombing spree, and he turned himself in because he was super wealthy. He got a good deal, and he never went to prison. And now he's just kind of a regular Democrat, a kind of lame, boring liberal in Chicago politics. But that raises the question. It's worth pointing out. That raises the question of why it was that this group, this Weather Underground organization, existed. Why they did what they did raises some questions. So I just want to talk about the Weather Underground. I want to talk about who they were, where they came from, because it's kind of almost something that people consider to almost be kind of an urban legend, or it's kind of a mythology. It's something that happened. There was a group of communist activists in the United States in the 1970s who became bombers, who bombed buildings, and there's quite a lot to learn from what happened, how they became this left adventurist terrorist organization, what happened, and it paralleled things that were happening in Europe at the time. You had the Red Brigades in Italy. You had the Baader Meinhof organization, or the Red Army faction in Germany. And in the 1970s, there were a number of armed communist groups around the world and in the United States who engaged in left adventurist and terrorist activities And it's worth pointing out who they were and why they did what they did, etc. So I wanted to get into that a little bit. I wanted to get into that. So I wanted to start out by showing you, this is the trailer for the documentary that PBS made about the Weather Underground. This came out in around 2003, I think. This is the trailer about the Weather Underground.
The FBI said the Weather Underground organization, which took credit for the bombing, is the same radical group which was responsible for the bombing of the U.S. Capitol in 1971 and the Pentagon in 1972.
Hello. This is the first communication from the Weatherman Underground. I'm going to read a declaration of a state of war. Kids know the lines are drawn. Revolution is touching all of our lives.
This system is going to be overthrown. It's going to mean a fight. And it's going to mean a lot of white people risking a lot of things.
Don't ever say we're going into a revolution. We're in a revolution. Now the question is, who's going to win it?
Freaks are revolutionaries, and revolutionaries are freaks. Within the next 14 days, we will attack a symbol or institution of American injustice.
Anyone who does have any information on where these people are located should immediately contact the FBI.
There's no way to be committed to nonviolence in the middle of the most violent society that history's ever created. I'm not committed to nonviolence in any way.
When you feel that you have right on your side, you can do some horrific things.
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk of this organization, what they did, where they came from, the fact that that a lot of them did not go to prison for what they did. I mean, they committed, very serious acts of terrorism, bombings that destroyed property. They destroyed a number of buildings. Why? What happened? So you have to understand that at that point, you remember, you had the Vietnam War that was going on. A lot of Americans were being drafted to go and fight in Vietnam. The Vietnam War was increasingly unpopular among college-aged Americans. They didn't want to go fight in Vietnam. You had the civil rights movement that was happening, and the civil rights movement had kind of turned into the Black liberation movement. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been shot and killed, and April of 1968, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been killed, there was rioting and rebellions in every major city in the United States. The military was sent in to many, many major cities to put down rebellions among the Black community. You had the Black Panthers, that were a Marxist-Leninist organization among Black people that were wildly popular. They're kind of seen as the heroes of the Black community. So in that context, you had a lot of younger Americans who were against the Vietnam War and went as far as supporting the Vietnamese and saying the Vietnamese were right, that the Vietnamese people were right, and the U.S. imperialists were wrong. I think I've got an image here of one of the, I think, it was common for some of these younger college students to march through the streets with the flag of the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. And they would chant, "One side's right, one side's wrong, victory to the Viet Cong," or "Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is going to win." Let me see if I have a photo of that. But you had a number of these young kind of radicals that did support, here we go. That did support the Vietnamese, and they took the opposite position in the Vietnam War. I'll just put that on the screen here. Right, this was common among college-aged radicals. Victory to the Viet Cong, right? And then Capitalism means imperialism, smash it, right? Is the sign there, and that was a trend that happened. The U.S. economy, you have to remember, was still very strong during these years. It was still very strong. You still had a lot of people that were very happy and had good paying jobs. You had a big middle class, a lot of industrial workers, steel workers, auto workers. So it was really only among like kind of college aged intellectuals that these communist groups had a following. And in the black community, there was a lot of sympathy for the Black Panthers and a lot of sympathy for forces around the world that were opposing U.S. imperialism. Now, in the early part of the 1960s, there had been a college campus activist group that had been set up by the liberals, and it was called Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. And Students for a Democratic Society was on a lot of different college campuses, and it was an organization of people who believed, they vaguely supported the civil rights movement. They believed in like supporting labor unions, and they were in support of opposing the Vietnam War, and they were everywhere. Students for a Democratic Society. Almost every major college had a chapter of this group called Students for a Democratic Society. And Students for a Democratic Society was funded by the United Auto Workers Union. And there were the people that were at the top of it, a lot of them had intelligence connections. They were tied to the more liberal wing of the CIA. And it was kind of a pushback against McCarthyism. You had this group, Students for a Democratic Society, that had formed everywhere. But as the 1960s went on, and as the political crisis intensified, Students for a Democratic Society largely became dominated by communists. There were different communist factions in it. Originally, it had banned communists from membership, but after a while, SDS became dominated by different communist factions, the largest of which was called the Progressive Labor Party. And the Progressive Labor Party was a breakaway from the Communist Party that admired Stalin, that thought that Khrushchev denouncing Stalin was no good, that took leadership from China. But the Progressive Labor Party, they started to change politically. They didn't like the Black Panthers. They said that the Black Panthers were black fascists because they advocated a racially separate organization. They also started to criticize the Vietnamese because the Vietnamese National Liberation Front was negotiating with the United States. They thought that was selling out. And so the Progressive Labor Party had also criticized China. When Richard Nixon went to China, they cut their ties with China because they said that China wasn't revolutionary enough. And the Progressive Labor Party became kind of distant. It wasn't supporting the Black Panthers. It wasn't supporting the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. It wasn't supporting the Vietnamese anymore. And it was Progressive Labor Party was kind of drifting in a more radical, or I don't know if you want to call it a more radical direction, but they were cutting themselves off from the various forces of resistance around the world and in the United States. They cut themselves off from the Panthers. They cut themselves off from the Vietnamese and from China, et cetera. And so they were distancing themselves from revolutionary forces. So the opposition within Students for a Democratic Society to the Progressive Labor Party, the opposition was, it was a number of people in Students for a Democratic Society who did not agree with Progressive Labor Party. They wanted to support the Black Panthers. They wanted to support the Vietnamese, et cetera. And so the forces within Students for a Democratic Society who wanted to continue supporting the Vietnamese and the Black Panthers, they wrote a manifesto. And the title of the manifesto came from a Bob Dylan song, right? There was a Bob Dylan song that came out. It's called Subterranean Homesick Blues. And Bob Dylan was very popular. He was like a folk singer who was popular among leftists, etc. And Bob Dylan, he wrote this song, Subterranean Homesick Blues. And there's a line in the song, which is, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows." Right? That's a line from the Bob Dylan song. A lot of the song is just kind of nonsense words. I think the opening line of the song is like, "Johnny's in the basement mixing up the medicine. I'm on the pavement thinking about the government." It's kind of nonsense words. But there's a line in it, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows." So the manifesto of the group in Students for a Democratic Society that was against the Progressive Labor Party, that wanted to continue supporting the Vietnamese, that wanted to continue supporting the Black Panthers, was called You Don't Need a Weatherman to Know Which Way the Wind Blows. And they called themselves the Revolutionary Youth Movement, the RYM. But everyone started calling them the Weathermen or the Weather People after that, because that became their nickname, because they had written this manifesto. You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows, that was widely circulated. It was a paper that was widely circulated in the organization. So the Revolutionary Youth Movement, it was basically the people that were the kind of the celebrities that were the leaders of Students for a Democratic Society. And it was kind of interesting. Mark Rudd, he had been the leader of the Columbia protests at Columbia University in New York City. The students had seized buildings, and the police had dragged them out of buildings. There'd been an uprising at Columbia University. The guy who was the leader of it in New York City, who became kind of a local celebrity, they even based a character in the comic book Doonesbury on him, and he became like a local celebrity. He was just this well-known activist in New York City. It was a guy named Mark Rudd. Well, Mark Rudd became a weatherman. There was Bill Ayers, who is from one of the wealthiest families in Chicago. I think his family are billionaires, if I'm not mistaken. And he's from a very, very wealthy family in Chicago. And he was a national leader of SDS, very well known. There was a woman named Bernadine Dorn, who had, become a lawyer. And she was a well-known radical activist, and a number of people that had been leaders of Students for a Democratic Society that were they got a lot of media attention for what they did. They would appear on television a lot. They became known as the leaders of this weather group. They weren't the underground yet. They were just the Revolutionary Youth Movement. And so they had a convention of Students for a Democratic Society, and in Chicago, where it was 1969, and they gathered all the different forces, and the group fell apart, and the convention was complete and utter chaos. Apparently, both sides, the Progressive Labor Party and Students for a Democratic Society, were waving Mao's Red Book at each other. There was fistfights and violence between the different factions, and at the end of the day, Students for a Democratic Society split into two organizations. One was controlled by the Progressive Labor Party, and it was called itself the Workers' Student Alliance. And the Workers' Student Alliance, they were called. They made a point they urged college kids to drop out and get jobs in factories in order to spread communism to the workers in the factories. And then you had the other SDS, which was the Revolutionary Youth Movement. And their position was that it was time to engage in street fighting. And they had what they called kick-ass marches, where they would get together and break windows and engage in property destruction. So you had one group that was promoting people working in factories. You had another group that was promoting property destruction. And the Revolutionary Youth Movement, they announced that they were going to have an event called the Days of Rage. And they were going to gather a whole bunch of people in Chicago for a big violent confrontation with the police. And they were going to call it the Days of Rage. And their slogan was, "Bring the war home." That was what they called for. Bring the war home. And they were going to have the Days of Rage. And it was quite a small gathering. They expected there would be thousands of people there, and it was actually just a couple hundred people. They, in downtown Chicago, they gathered, and they were wearing they were wearing football helmets, and they had chains and baseball bats and weapons, and they fought the police. The police opened fire on the protest. No one was killed, luckily. But after that, there were some bombs that went off around Chicago. There was the home of a police officer was bombed. And there was a bombing that someone blew up a statue. There was a statue in Haymarket Square to honor the police. And there was some bombings. And then after that, they had a gathering in Flint, Michigan that they called their National War Council. and it was a public event. There were hundreds of people there, and at their National War Council, they called in Flint, Michigan, they were announcing what their plan was to kind of build a mass revolutionary movement, and they honored Charles Manson, and they said that Charles Manson was a great revolutionary. And I guess the quote is that Bernardine Dohrn got up and said that Charles Manson had killed one of his victims. I guess one of the women who'd been killed by Charles Manson had been killed with a fork. And that was cool. And so they all started fork saluting each other and saluting with like the fork. That was how they started addressing it. And the Weathermen, their position was basically that that white American workers were the enemy. However, among young people who became hippies, the idea was that young people who became hippies, they were the ones that could be recruited to be like a section of the American white people that would align with the black people, that would align with the third world in kind of a national liberation and a global struggle against imperialism, and that the hippies, the counterculture, would be the base. That was their position, right? They saw average white American workers as the enemy. They were against the American government and against Vietnam. They supported the Black Panthers, and that their position was that that they were going to recruit all the hippies to go out and be violent street fighters. Now, one thing that was interesting is that, historically communists have opposed drug use. Drugs are considered to be a tool of capitalist oppression. Drugs are considered to be something that, destroys people's lives. It's the tool of the capitalists. However, the Weathermen promoted drug use like crazy. They argued that that marijuana and LSD would somehow lead people to become revolutionary. And they were promoting LSD. They were promoting drug use, and they would initiate members to make sure someone wasn't a police officer. If someone joined the group, to make sure they weren't an undercover cop, they would put them on LSD and interrogate them on LSD while they were tripping, things like that. They lived together. They had little groups that lived together, and they would engage in a lot of semi-illegal activities. They took the position that if you worked a regular job, you were a pig, you were exploiting the system. So they would shoplift all their food. They would engage in small-time little crimes in order to support themselves. They were like a criminal organization, I guess, with political aspirations. They did take some strange positions. They took the position that monogamy, having one sexual partner, was reactionary, and so they were requiring members to have sex with multiple people, because if you had sex with only one person, you were celebrating patriarchy or something to that effect. It was kind of a strange group, and they engaged in these rather violent street confrontations with the police, and then one day they were gone. And I've met older communists who remember this. It was weird. It was like for about a year, the Weathermen were everywhere. They were out there breaking windows. They were promoting drug use, and then one day they were just gone. Their offices were gone. The houses where they lived were gone. They were just gone. And no one knew what happened. And a lot of their members didn't know what happened. A lot of their members wondered where they went. A lot of their members, one day they went to go meet with other members of the group, and there was no one there. The group just kind of vanished. And people wondered what had happened. I mean, it was just gone. Then a couple months after the group vanished, there was a radio message that was delivered where Bernardine Dohrn, who had been the famous lawyer woman who was the leader of the group, she gave a statement announcing that she had declared war against the American government. And then a bomb went off someplace. They blew something up. And it was like every couple months, something would get blown up. And every couple months, there would be a bomb that would go off somewhere. And usually beforehand, there would be a radio statement. Like they would record like an audio of themselves making the statement, and then they would blow up a building. And that was what happened. And it seems like there were only about 30 of them that went underground and joined the bombing group, even though it had been a group of maybe 2,000, maybe 800, 900 people. By the time they became the bombing group, they became a group of less than 30 people, and they did these symbolic bombings. And the symbolic bombings were kind of based on this assumption that, well, like average Americans could never become communists. Average Americans could never be revolutionary. So we're going to be the good Americans. And this comes across if you read any of their memoirs and such. It was about moral purity. It wasn't based on, this is going to advance the class struggle. It was based on, well, this is moral, right? America is an evil country. America is just like Nazi Germany, but we're the good Americans. We support the black people. We support the Vietnamese people. We oppose American imperialism. So to prove that we're good, we're going to set off these bombs, and we're going to go into hiding, and we're going to set off these bombs. And it was just kind of a moral purity thing, that they were more concerned about kind of, they had this badge of like, we are morally superior. America is an evil, racist country. But we are the good Americans. And so they set off bombs, and they engaged in bombings. Now, after a while, at first it got a huge amount of attention in the media that, oh my God, there's this group of hippies that are blowing things up and bombing buildings. But after a while, the media didn't really care anymore. And, they claim they never killed anyone. Now, there are some people who dispute it. They say that in the bombing that they did in Chicago, that they killed somebody. But regardless, right, generally their what do you call it? Their way of operating was that they would set the bomb someplace, then they would call in and make the threat, and then the building would be evacuated so that no one died. I believe they bombed the U.S. Capitol. They bombed a number of different buildings. A lot of different colleges were bombed, police stations, things like that. And they did this, and after a while, the media stopped really paying attention to them. Now, what's interesting is that, they had kind of a moment where they realized that they weren't really accomplishing anything. So then, and this is very interesting to me, they published a book. Like about what they believed. I'll put the cover of it on the screen. And this book was called Prairie Fire: The Politics of Anti-Imperialism. And it was like they realized that they'd kind of made a mistake by going underground because no one was paying any attention to them. So they published this book. Prairie Fire: The Politics of Anti-Imperialism, Political Statement of the Weather Underground. And they distributed it mysteriously all over the country, like thousands and thousands of copies of this. In every major city, it was distributed. You could find copies of it at coffee shops and any like left-wing space, anything that was considered like a place where communists would hang out. You would find this manifesto they wrote. And the manifesto, you can read it. It's all online. It's basically, America is an evil imperialist, society that's racist, that is oppressing people all over the world. They support the Vietnamese, etc. And, what's interesting, because there's a lot of history of the Weathermen out there. There's a lot of history of the Weathermen out there. A very good question. But there's one guy who I have been reading about lately, who rarely gets mentioned in the history of the Weather Underground, but was probably a very vitally important figure in their history. He gets left out of a lot of the memoirs, but it was this guy, the guy on the right there, the guy with the little mustache, this guy, Clayton Van Lydegraf. And his name is kind of obscure. I passingly mentioned him in the Letter to Bob Avakian book, but this guy, Clayton Van Lydegraf, he was a figure within the Weather Underground, but he was older, and he'd been a member of the Communist Party of the United States. He had fought in World War II, And this guy appears to be the guy who kind of, ideologically influenced them and told them what to do. And apparently he wrote most of the book, the Prairie Fire book. He wrote it. And he was kind of their mentor. And he was an older guy. And it looks like more or less he was the guy who was kind of guiding them to do what they did. And he has a very interesting history. People wonder about this guy. Apparently there were members of Congress who maintained that this guy had carried out some assassinations in the Philippines. That after World War II, he had gone to the Philippines where there were some uprisings against the United States and against the military there. And it's alleged by members of Congress that this guy Clayton Van Lydegraaf had actually engaged in some assassinations in the Philippines. And that this guy was pretty ruthless. He was, his job, he was a repairman. He repaired refrigerators for a living. But he was this very dedicated communist, this older guy. And he had been very pro Stalin and very pro Soviet Union. But then when Khrushchev had given his secret speech, he had defended Stalin. He'd gotten kicked out of the Communist Party. And he was just this older guy who hung out in communist circles and was he knew about violence. And if you read anything about Clayton Van Lydegraaf, he was a very violent fellow. This was you think about like a mafia hitman or something like that. This guy knew how to kill somebody. This guy knew how to fire a gun. He was a pretty ruthless individual. And he had written a number of like manifestos and stuff. And he was kind of the guy who was mentoring and leading the Weathermen. And he doesn't get a lot of attention. And apparently after they did the bombing campaign, he realized that they were isolated, that they were just doing these bombings and that no one had ever heard of them. Here's another picture, by the way, of Clayton Van Lydegraaf. Again, this is an individual who they leave his name out of a lot of the memoirs, but he's kind of, he was probably very influential. That's him standing next to William Z. Foster when he was still in the Communist Party. There's William Z. Foster, the greatest American communist, and then there's Clayton Van Lydegraaf standing next to him. And that apparently Clayton Van Lydegraaf, he was basically saying to them that you can't, if you're gonna be isolated. He was telling them they needed to figure out a way to not be underground again. So then after the book was published, after they published this book, which was called, this book, Prairie Fire, Clayton Van Lydegraaf formed an above ground legal organization called the Prairie Fire Organizing Committee. The Prairie Fire Organizing Committee. And it was a group of people that were legal, that were above ground, that didn't engage in illegal activities, but supported the Weathermen. And it was like a group of, college students and others that studied that book and supported the Weathermen. And they apparently had quite a lot of funding. They would have big conferences and stuff. And they themselves were the legal, like above ground wing of the Weather Underground organization. And they had a big conference called the National Hard Times Conference. Hard times are fighting times. And they invited a lot of different communist groups. And it looked like the Weathermen kind of felt like they had made a mistake by going underground and engaging in these bombing campaigns. And that by doing that, they had actually isolated themselves. So they were trying, with this book that they wrote and with Clayton Van Lydegraaf telling them what to do, they formed this above ground organization, and they were trying to like set the stage for like not being underground anymore and building like a legal mass movement of some type. They were trying to do that. Long story short, when Jimmy Carter was president, as Jimmy Carter was president, as they were getting ready for Ronald Reagan to be president, they all turned themselves in for the most part. Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dohrn turned themselves in and were arrested. A number of them just turned themselves in, but they had made a deal, I guess, through a back channel to the Carter administration and the Department of Justice. They'd made a deal that if they turned themselves in, that then the charges against them would be dropped because the FBI had committed so much misconduct while investigating them. You know, in the Carter administration, you had the Church Committee, it was called, and the Church Committee was revealing COINTELPRO and a lot of the crimes of the FBI during this period. And so because all of the illegal activities of the FBI, killing Fred Hampton, murdering Black Panthers, and all that was being revealed, the understanding was that they could turn themselves in and then the charges would be dropped because of FBI misconduct. And apparently the FBI misconduct was pretty extreme. From what I understand, Bill Ayers, who was the leader of the Weather Underground, his brother, the FBI went to his home and he had an apartment, and they hung him by his ankles out the window. To try and get him to say whatever information he had on his brother. So the FBI took Bill Ayers' brother, and they held him out the window by his ankles, threatening to drop him if he didn't tell them, where his brother was. And he didn't tell them because he didn't know. But the FBI was doing things pretty blatantly illegal like that. And so this deal was made with the Carter administration as Jimmy Carter was leaving office. They could all turn themselves in, and they wouldn't go to prison. So most of them did. Most of them did turn themselves in. And you got to admit, I mean, you have to point out they were all from really, really wealthy families. They were millionaires and billionaires, the sons of wealthy people. And that there was then a group that didn't turn themselves in. There were some of them that didn't turn themselves in, and they became the May 19th Communist Organization. That was what they called themselves, and some of them called themselves the Revolutionary Armed Task Force. And those people who didn't turn themselves in, they did go to prison. A lot of them were caught, and they went to prison for many decades. That was that. And you look at that whole episode, and it's really kind of sad. Left adventurism and terrorism tends to be a tactic that revolutionaries take up when they don't think they can win. When there's kind of an assumption that you can't possibly win, when you can't build a base among the population, you can't win people over. It's almost it's a tactic of retreat, and that's really if you read what the Weathermen had written about, if you read Prairie Fire, the politics of anti-imperialism, if you read the memoirs of the Weather Underground members, that was basically what they assumed. Average Americans would never be won over to their worldview. Average Americans were the enemy. They were white, but they were the good white people, and other white people are all racist and bad. And you can see an echo of a lot of their beliefs in wokeism. And that's worth pointing out. I mean, you can see a really big echo of a lot of what they believed in the wokest worldview, right? Average people are the enemy. The good people are the oppressed, are the not white people. We'd never talk about economics. You just kind of have contempt for America as an evil, racist settler country, blah, 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 blah. You can see echoes of it. You can see echoes of it all throughout, wokeism. What's interesting, though, and why it was relevant to briefly bring this up in this book is that not everyone in the revolutionary youth movement embraced the tactics of the Weather Underground. And this is important. The Weather Underground, the Weathermen, they announced they were going to recruit young people. They were promoting drug use, etc. There was another faction, a group of people in the revolutionary youth movement who broke away, and they formed what was called Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, right? And that was people that rejected the left adventurous tactics that the Weathermen were adopting and took the position that in support of the Black Panthers and in support of the Vietnamese National Liberation Front, it was necessary to go and build a mass movement among the white working class to stand in solidarity with the oppressed. And that grouping, the Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, laid the basis for what generally is referred to as the New Communist Movement. The New Communist Movement, right? And the New Communist Movement, I have studied extensively because on the one hand, the New Communist Movement in the 1970s is a tragedy because the U.S. economy was still strong enough that these people, they just couldn't really have a base among the population because, the economy was still strong enough. People didn't want to hear it. But the new communist movement of the 1970s, it still had the right idea. It was very much an out of the movement to the masses notion, right? They understood that the hippies and the counterculture were not the people that were going to lead the revolution. And they tried their hardest to bring revolutionary politics to the bulk of the American working class. And you can read about the new communist movement, and a lot of memoirs have been published. And I would argue that the new communist movement of the 1970s, those who rejected terrorism and rejected left adventurism, more or less lays the basis of what we're trying to do with CPI. We're trying to organize the broad masses of Americans. We reject the hippie counterculture. We reject the woke stuff. We reject the synthetic left. We certainly reject terrorism and violence. We advocate a peaceful transition to socialism. And that we are trying to bring a politics of anti-imperialism to average Americans. And largely, the new communist movement of the 70s, the NCM, was based on kind of seeing the failure of groups like the Weather Underground, and instead arguing that it was necessary to go to the masses with a revolutionary movement and with politics of anti-imperialism. So all of this is very important, and I think all of this is worth discussing, right? And that this is part of our history, and I wish people would know the history of our movement, right? You can't talk about building communism among the American working class. You can't talk about, urging the U.S. working class to stand in solidarity with countries like Russia and China, et cetera. You can't do that without studying who's done this before. And we study the Communist Party of the 1930s. We study the Black Panthers. And it's worth studying the new communist movement, but also worth studying the deviations, right? The people who, the Weathermen, they went full woke. They went into hating average American workers. They went into embracing the counterculture and the drug use. And, it was like there was like a fork in the road, and they went in that direction. Now, the tragedy is that a lot of the new communist movement, even though in the 1970s they kind of had the right idea, a lot of them have kind of deteriorated into being just Democrats. And that's what I argue. And Bob Avakian endorsed Biden in the 2020 election. And while I praise him for some of the important work he's done over the years, I also call him out for the fact that he's not standing with Russia and China, et cetera. He's not standing with Russia and China. He's not at this point making an appeal to the broad masses of Americans. He's tailing after the Democratic Party. And so, this book I wrote, Letter to Bob Avakian, is important because it's a summation of the new communist movement. It's talking about where things went astray, and there's a lot of information in there. And so in the context of understanding all of this, I thought it was worth going over this history and talking about the Weathermen, talking about the new communist movement, talking about SDS. These things are important. Now, obviously, the 1930s communist movement, where they had a mass base among the population, is far more important and worth studying. And obviously, the Black Panthers, who had a base in the Black community, they had a lot of people who supported them. They're obviously far more important to study. But it's worth looking into these different trends that existed. Right. And the Weathermen became left adventurous terrorists. They embraced the counterculture. That's not what we want to do, obviously, but it's interesting. We need to be aware of people who did these kind of things, and that many people speculate that a lot of those groups in the 1970s, the Weathermen, the Red Army faction, the Red Brigades in Italy. I mean, it's revealed, it's documented with the Red Brigades in Italy that they were apparently funded by intelligence, right? That as part of Operation Gladio, the U.S. government was very afraid that Italy would elect an anti-NATO government. And because of that, because they were very afraid of this, they apparently were funding various groups and manipulating Italian politics in a number of different ways, some of which included funding the Red Brigades because they engaged in terrorism. They killed leaders of the Italian Communist Party because they thought they were sellouts. They engaged in bombings that terrified Italian people, made people think communists were very dangerous, and that part of Operation Gladio was covert support for ultra-left adventurous terrorist organizations. It's interesting. It's very, very interesting. The Red Brigades of Italy, etc. And that the weathermen, I mean, the fact that none of them went to jail, none of them went to prison, I mean, that is very suspect. And the fact that they were able to reach this deal and not go to prison. I mean, who can bomb the U.S. Capitol and not go to prison? I guess a billionaire can, but you get the idea that they were well connected enough. There were people within the government apparatus that were supporting them, that were kind of giving them permission to do what they were doing, and that there was a fight in the ruling class, and that they were a counter gang to some degree or other. That it's been revealed, I guess, to some degree or other, they were heavily infiltrated. And we don't know to what degree or other there were people in the American government who were using them as pawns in some kind of internal fight, but it certainly looks that way. The more you dig into it, it really does look like the way they were able to establish this legal above ground organization and distribute this manifesto everywhere, and it looks like there was some section of the American deep state that was using them for some operation or other, and that's why they were able to legally go above ground, etc. It starts to look that way the more you look into them. But the whole thing is very, very strange, and it's kind of that murky world of intelligence and the Cold War, etc. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about that since I was thinking about what can I talk about for my noon stream. Wanted to just go over that history because there's a lot of confusion about it. I hear people often say mistaken things about it. So I wanted to just talk about that for my noon stream today. So yeah, I'm just chilling here. It's noon. So why don't we do the roll call? I'll call you all out as I see you. Names and locations, names and locations. I got 2 questions so far. Names and locations, names and locations. I'll answer people's questions after I do the roll call. So I'll call people out. I don't see any Rumble rants yet. Don't see anything on the Rockfin, but I do see two questions on the in the super chat. So names and locations, names and locations. Who's with us today? Names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Names and locations. All right, we got Rupert Fellows in England. We got Scott in New York. We got Dustin Schlesinger in Cleveland, Ohio. We got Megan in Kansas City. Welcome, Megan. Terry in the office. Shout out to you, Terry. Meredith and Quinn from Washington. Shout out to you. Jenny in Cincinnati. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Anybody else? Names and locations. Names and locations. Jamie in St. Paul. Lexington, Kentucky. Randall Wilson. Victory Gin in New Mexico. Names and locations. Names and locations. Patrick in Maine is with us today. Welcome, Patrick. Good to have you. Patrick in Maine is with us. Bob Troy in New York. Alex from Brazil is with us. Welcome, Alex. Patrick in Maine. Bob Troy in New York. Names and locations. Who is with us today? Ian Chester in England is with us. Welcome, Ian. Good to have you with us. Patch in Arizona. Welcome, 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 Patch. Good to have you. Good to have you, Patch. Names and locations. Names and locations. Ottawa in work in progress. Good to have you. Good to have you. Good to have you. Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us today? Conrad from Poland. Welcome, Conrad. And this is a good time, right? This is why we do these morning streams, because people in Europe, it's better for them. Timoshenko in St. Louis. Good to have you there, Timoshenko. We got Mike in Windsor, Ontario. Welcome, Mike. Welcome, Mike. Good to have you. Good to have you. Names and locations. Who is with us? Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us? Names and locations. Names and locations. Is anyone in the Rockfin? I see Chris in Texas is in the Rockfin, and St. David's, Bermuda is in the Rockfin, or is in the Rumble. On the Rockfin, I just see Victory Gin saying, hey, winners. Chris in Salt Lake City. Very good. Carl in Washington. Ian Jacobson in Denmark. Very, very good. Very, very good. Richard Burns says he thought Terry Strange and Jenny Lynn were the same person. Well, that is not true. Terry Strange, I have now met in person. Jenny Lynn, I have not yet met in person, but Jenny Lynn is in Cincinnati and Terry Strange is in Portland. So they are different people, right? What is that old thing that they say, right? There are no women on the internet. There are no girls on the internet. Well, there definitely are. There's Jenny Lynn. There's Terry Strange. There's many different females that are indeed on the internet. So they do exist. It's not all just gross, sweaty men, trying to one up each other on our knowledge. I have often said on my streams and in speeches that I've given that women are better than men. And I maintain that in a lot of ways that is the truth, because women are better organizers than men. Women are better at building community than men. A lot of guys, unfortunately, just don't understand the importance of in real life activism, of keeping communities together. Instead, they just kind of want to talk about what they know, and that's a problem, right? And if you're trying to build a real organization, you need women, because women know how to do it. Women know how to get along with people. Women know how to network, how to maintain relationships. Women have way better social skills than men. They just do, right? They just do. And yes, Terry is confirming that she is indeed a different person than Jenny Lynn. Women just have skills that men don't have. And if you're building an organization, you just have to recognize that, right? I mean, they do, right? Women are just better organizers than men, no question about it. And I mean, men and women are obviously socialized differently in our society. And part of the way women are socialized is it results in them being better. They have better friendships than men do. They have better organizing skills. We also try to keep people together and keep them from fighting over stupid shit. Exactly. Women have inherent sacred value. They alone can create a new immortal soul. Don't know about that, but there you go. And then Jamie says, it's because we are mamas. Okay. Well, very good. Very, very good. Very, very good. I'll get to that. Very good. All right. So now I've got 3 super chat questions to answer. I guess this will probably be a short stream unless more super chats come in, but that's fine. We're just doing 2 a day here. We're doing 2 a day because, that's what we want to do. And I'll be back tonight, probably around 10 p.m. But yeah, I'll start answering people's super chats. People have anything they want me to talk about, now is the time. Oh, and there's a Rumble rant that came in asking me about Anthony Sutton. So I've addressed that before, but it's worth addressing again. That's good. So that's a Rumble rant. So I guess the way I do it generally is I do the Rumble rants first. So it looks like Zacharani asked me about Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution by Anthony Sutton. Any thoughts on that? Okay, so I'll do that one first, and then I'll answer the Rumble rants, because that's, or the Rockfin or the super chats. That's how I do things. So Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution by Anthony Sutton is a book that maintains that the Russian Revolution was a Wall Street conspiracy. It's a conservative book. It's popular in libertarian circles, and it maintains that because some of the claims in there are ridiculous. A lot of the book just focuses on the facts that various American corporations, to make money, did business with the Soviet Union. Ford Motor Company did business with the Soviet Union. That's true. General Electric did business with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a huge country with millions of people, and it was trying to industrialize, and it hired a lot of American technicians and engineers to go and do business over there. What does that prove? I mean, that's a ridiculous argument. I mean, Fred Koch, the father of the Koch brothers, he went over to the Soviet Union. He helped them set up their oil industry. He helped Stalin set up the oil industry. That doesn't prove that the Soviet Union was a big conspiracy by Fred Koch. Ford helped the Soviet Union get their car industry going. They paid for it. It was a business deal, right? Having joint ventures, hiring, industrial corporations from Western countries to help you set up your industry for pay. That is not proof that the Soviet Union was therefore all a big conspiracy by Wall Street. And that's one of the claims in the book. And that's the bulk of the book focuses on that. It's like, and this guy who wrote it, Anthony Sutton, is like a John Birch Society kind of guy. And he maintains communism is a big Wall Street conspiracy. And so he just he's just kind of going after various American companies that did business in the Soviet Union. There was a guy named Armand Hammer. And he was an American capitalist. He, in the 80s and 70s, he was known for being a pro-Soviet guy because he did business over there, right? That just because the Soviet Union did business over there doesn't mean that they were agents, right? And that part of Stalin's concept of socialism in one country was that they were going to start doing business. They were going to hire American technicians. They were going to hire engineers and scientists, et cetera, to go over there and help them set up their industry. That doesn't make it a conspiracy. Many American corporations did business with the Soviet Union. That doesn't make it a conspiracy. The other things in the book, he talks about how Trotsky got a visa to come to the United States. Well, that's true, but you have to remember also Trotsky was a well-known, Trotsky was an asset of German intelligence at that point. His theory of permanent revolution was accredited to a guy by the name of, what was his name? Alexander Parvus. Alexander Parvus, who was a German secret police guy, was kind of mentoring Trotsky and had Trotsky push the theory of permanent revolution, and that Trotsky didn't become a Bolshevik until July of 1917. Trotsky was this well-known Russian guy who was living in exile in Paris and Vienna and London and all the urban centers of Europe. And he lived in New York City for a while, and he got a visa to come to the United States. Does that make the Russian Revolution a conspiracy? No. You have to remember Trotsky had very little to do with the Russian Revolution. He didn't get there until it had already happened, right? I mean, the February Revolution to bring down the Tsar had already happened by the time he got there. Lenin arrived in April with his April thesis. The Bolsheviks got going. Trotsky didn't join the Bolsheviks until July. So Trotsky was pretty late in the game. So the fact that Trotsky got a visa, and that's a big part of the Anthony Sutton book, is that Trotsky got a visa to enter the United States. Well, so what? I mean, that doesn't prove anything. That's first of all, Trotsky's legal name, was not Trotsky. You know that, right? That, he was under a false name and a false passport anyway. His real name was Levi Bronstein, but he went by Leon Trotsky. He was living under a fake name of a stolen passport, and that he was an asset of German intelligence, right? That Alexander Parvus was managing him. The idea that Trotsky getting a visa to enter the United States, very good question, Gala, and you're on the list. The idea that Trotsky getting a visa to enter the United States made the Russian Revolution a big conspiracy. That's like a non sequitur. That's a complete non sequitur. Trotsky ended up then becoming a big traitor and betraying the Soviet Union. So the whole thing is just silly. I mean, it's a silly claim, right? All these companies did business with the Soviet Union. So what? Trotsky got a visa. So what? A lot of the theories about the Russian Revolution being a Wall Street conspiracy center around the notion that this guy named Jacob Schiff, who was a very wealthy Wall Street banker, donated to something called the Russian Freedom Group, which was a group that was opposed to the Tsar. And people try to say that meant that he funded the Bolsheviks. Well, the Russian Freedom Group, wrong. They were not Bolsheviks. They were anti-Bolsheviks. And the World Zionist Organization thought Marxism was its biggest enemy. So all of that stuff is very surface level. And it feeds into a mindset, and this is really common among the conspiracy crowd, that everything's a conspiracy. Everything's a conspiracy. Everything's a big conspiracy. Everything's a big conspiracy. There are no good guys. All the secret controllers secretly control everything. There is no hope. That is a really widespread belief among the forces of conspiratorialism, and it leads to not doing any activism because there is no hope. And they don't understand that if they were all on the same page, the world would make a lot more sense, and the world would be a lot more better organized. The elite, the ruling class, the rich, the billionaires, the monopolies, they're not all on the same page. There are divisions among the ruling class. They are struggling for power among each other. And it's through the divisions in the ruling class that we begin to assert our own agenda. And that's what I talk about with, I talk about in this book, Where is America Going? Marxism, MAGA, and the Coming Revolution. I talk about the divide in the ruling class, etc. So all of that is important. So I hope that answers your question, Zach Ronnie. That was a Rumble rant. Now I'll start answering super chats. Thoughts on Lukashenko and Belarus? I have a very positive view of Lukashenko because he's protected the people of Belarus from neoliberalism. After the fall of the Soviet Union, and I have a book somewhere. I'm trying to see if I have a book on Belarus that's very good. But after the fall, here it is. This book on Belarus is very, very good. The Last Soviet Republic, Alexander Lukashenko's Belarus by Stuart Parker. This is a very, very good book published in Canada. And Lukashenko is just a popular leader. And he was critical of the Soviet Union. He knew the Soviet Union had problems, but he didn't believe in capitalism. He didn't believe in the free market. He was proud of the heritage of defeating the Nazis. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, all the other former Soviet republics were being economically looted. And he said, we ain't going to have that here. We're not going to have looting in Belarus. We're not going to have economic looting. And Alexander Lukashenko protected Belarus from neoliberalism, and he maintained that Belarus, he maintained full employment for the population. He maintained health care for the population, and he did a lot to economically protect Belarus from the disaster of the fall of the Soviet Union, and that made him wildly popular. The people in Belarus are very happy about the fact that they didn't suffer the way most of the former Soviet countries suffered after the fall of the Soviet Union. That made him very popular. Now, Belarus and Russia don't always get along. There's back and forth. There are disagreements, but they're both anti-imperialist states. And right now, they are solidly unified. The Belarus is solidly with Russia on the Ukraine conflict, anti-NATO. And that I have a very positive view of Lukashenko. If you read this book, you'll read about someone who stood up to neoliberalism, defeated various coup attempts. I have a very, very positive view of Alexander Lukashenko and of Belarus, because they have maintained resistance to neoliberal economics and the looting of the country. They've maintained their basic socialist apparatus. The Communist Party of Belarus is the biggest political party. Most of the seats in the National Assembly or the parliament are non-aligned, but the Communist Party is the biggest party. Belarus, they call it the last Soviet republic for a reason. I would maintain that Belarus is a socialist country. And Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, he visited Belarus and he said it's a socialist society. They have more or less a 21st century socialist economic model. You can see that. It's not capitalism. It is not a capitalist society. It is very much, they've maintained the best elements of the Soviet system while having, some reforms. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of corruption in Belarus. There's organized crime. There's problems. And, that's not to gloss over the many problems that society probably has. But overall, Belarus is an anti-imperialist socialist country. And I maintain that. And that drives people up the wall, and it makes people angry when I say that. Well, the global communist movement largely sees Belarus as a friend and an ally. So, they're with Venezuela, they're with Cuba, they're with North Korea, they're with China, they're with Russia. They're on the right side of history, and they've never, decommunized, right? All the communist monuments are still up. All the talk, the leader is praising communism all the time. It's like Belarus, they call it the last Soviet republic for a reason. So that's my thoughts on it. I have a very positive view of Belarus. Belarus is an anti-imperialist socialist society. Again, does it have problems? Of course, just like every other country. But the people of Belarus really benefited from the fact that the fall of the Soviet Union didn't really happen there. It happened a little bit, but not in the way it happened everywhere else. So there you go. All righty. Was the one-child policy Malthusian? I do not understand. They have gotten rid of it in China, the one-child policy. I don't understand it. I have heard different people explain it to me for economic reasons. It was related to, they didn't want there to be a rural bourgeoisie. It was about privatization of land. I've also heard people say that, unfortunately, the Wallace Global Fund, which is the estate of Henry Wallace, played a very negative role in promoting that. I don't understand the one-child policy, and I would like actually maybe at some point to interview someone from China who can explain it to me. But it no longer exists. They did get rid of it. But the one-child policy in China, they were trying to reduce the population. And it's an old anti-China talking point. Yeah, it's long been gotten rid of, but it was done. The people who defend it to me have told me it was done for specific economic reasons related to the countryside and agriculture. And I can't explain what those reasons are because I don't understand them thoroughly enough to explain it. So in the future, perhaps I can have a China expert explain to me what the policy was. I can't really explain it, but it's long gone. And treatment is right. It's long gone. It's an old anti-China talking point. Why did Biden unfreeze the Iran funds? That's an important question. And I believe that is because the Biden administration wants, to some degree or other, to go back to the Obama strategy of negotiating with Iran, right? It was very clear during the Obama administration. And I'll tell you, I lived this, right? I went to Iran a number of times during the Obama administration. I spoke at conferences in Iran. It was very clear that a section of the American deep state was hoping they could sink their fangs into Iran, was hoping that they could, suck up to the reformist movement, prop up the reformist movement, and with the Iran nuclear deal, push for some kind of Iranian Gorbachev to emerge who would dismantle the Islamic Republic, right? Kind of like what they did in Libya. You remember before Obama bombed and destroyed Libya, Obama got very close to Libya, and that America and Libya got closer. American companies started doing business more in Libya, and that they snuck the NGO color revolution apparatus in and destabilized. And that I think that with Iran, Obama and Biden, their feeling is that instead of isolating Iran, they want to slip American influence into Iran and set the stage for some kind of color revolution. That's, I think, what their strategy was, and that it makes sense for them, and it's kind of a long-term strategy of overthrowing the Islamic Republic. They wanted to prop up the reformist movement, which they saw as potentially a movement that could dismantle the Islamic Republic, and that it's pretty clear now. Opposing and hating Iran is generally the policy of the hard right Republicans. It's the policy of Netanyahu. It advances Netanyahu because Iran is the enemy, and Netanyahu plays up the idea we're under threat from Iran. It advances Israel. It advances. There's the Pahlavists, the deposed monarchists who are wealthy and fled to Southern California. They have a direct interest in that. There's certain constituencies that really want to escalate with Iran. But I think the overall feeling among the American intelligence apparatus is that they want to, de-escalate with Iran, get more friendly with Iran so they can slip American influence into Iran and destabilize Iran eventually. And that so Biden is following that strategy of trying to get closer to Iran. And you have to remember that Iran is also a very close military partner of Russia at this point. And that part of the strategy of Brzezinski, and who was kind of the mentor to Barack Obama at Columbia University, part of the strategy is to separate what they call satellite countries from Russia. And that I think that Brzezinski and all of them, they see Iran at this point as a satellite country to Russia and China. And so their hope is that if they can give Iran more of its money and more American companies can go to Iran, that'll pressure Iran to be less involved with Russia, maybe send Russia less weapons, etc. But it's failing. I mean, Russia and Iran are closer than they've ever been. They're closer than they've ever been. There was just a train that went from Russia to Iran to Saudi Arabia. One single train ride that went through all three countries. And Iran is part of the global anti-imperialist movement, and they're not going to leave. But part of the Biden administration strategy is to try and pull the anti-imperialist bloc apart. And this happened during the Carter administration. For example, during the Carter administration, Libya, there was huge efforts to separate Libya from the Soviet Union. Billy Carter, who is Jimmy Carter's younger brother, went to Libya and actually became a registered foreign agent of the Libyan government. And as a result of that, they were somewhat successful. Libya, didn't support the United States or didn't support the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And Libya spoke against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And there were a number of instances during the Carter administration where, because Jimmy Carter sent his younger brother there, there was kind of a softening of relations between the USA and Libya. And as a result, Libya was not as solidly in the Soviet camp as it normally was. And that changed during the Reagan administration. Reagan bombed Libya. Libya, at that point in the Reagan years, Libya made a point of saying they wanted to join the Warsaw Pact. And that Gaddafi even started talking blatantly like a Marxist, saying that Libya was going to have full communism at one point, et cetera. But that is the strategy of the Biden administration, of the Brzezinski soft power apparatus of the CIA. They generally like the idea of trying to separate what they call satellite countries from the mainstream, from the main, centers of anti-imperialism. That's why Obama went to Cuba, for example, right? And that they're thinking about the long-term strategy, whereas Russia and China, these two huge countries, are the main components. They're not as worried about Iran. They're not as worried about Cuba. Whereas, the Miami Cubans, they're obsessed with destroying Cuba. They don't care about Russia. They don't care about China. Whereas the Pahlavists, they're obsessed with overthrowing Iran. The big supporters of Netanyahu, they're obsessed with Iran. They don't care about Russia and China. There's kind of a difference, right? The lower levels of capital have these short-term vendettas, whereas, the geostrategic apparatus, the Council on Foreign Relations, et cetera, they are concerned about the overall goals of U.S. imperialism. All righty. And then Gala asks, what will happen with Israel-Palestine conflict going forward? I know no one probably knows the future, but I wonder if it will escalate now that Hezbollah is involved. It very well could. It very, very well could. Israel invaded Lebanon, has invaded Lebanon a number of times, but there's a very good chance that they will invade, very good chance they will invade Lebanon once again now that Hezbollah is involved in the conflict. Also, it's very important to note that Russia right now is just, Lavrov has made great remarks about how at this point they need to give the Palestinians their own state, how it's urgent that the Palestinians receive their own state. And if they don't receive their own state, things are going to escalate. Now, Norman Finkelstein gave a very eloquent, remarks on the Jimmy Dore show yesterday, pointing out that it looks like, they're talking about genocide of the Palestinians at this point. There's already, Gaza is already an open air prison, very densely populated. And now they've cut off all electricity, all food, all fuel, and they're going in. And now, and then Netanyahu tells the Palestinians will leave the areas where the terrorists are. Well, they can't because it's so densely populated. Gaza is not a very big place. And it looks like they are just going to go in there and exterminate the Palestinians. And that's what Norman Finkelstein was warning about. And it's very terrifying. They may just go in and just exterminate the Palestinians at this point, which is what many times that has been advocated by the hard Israeli right. And it looks like they may be getting ready to do that. And I hope the international community can do something to stop them from doing that. But it looks like that may be in the works. And the desperation and importance in Lavrov's remarks about the fact that we need to address this issue now, they need their own state now, that is very, very important. That's very, very, very important. So, I worry about what could happen. Now, will Israel go into Lebanon? Last time they went into Lebanon, they got their asses kicked. And I will say that the reason this is happening now is because, as I said before, Obama and his strategy of trying to polarize the Middle East against Iran didn't work. And Saudi Arabia and Iran are friends again. And the whole Middle East is cheering for the Palestinians and denouncing Israel. And so in these circumstances, it is more in the Palestinians' favor to launch a big, strong resistance now than it was before. And that, we're kind of back to where we were in 2006. In 2006, the whole Muslim world was cheering for Hezbollah, the pro-Iran organization, because it defeated Israel and it drove Israel out of Lebanon so effectively. And it appears that we're back in that situation because, despite all that Obama did with the Shia crescent and attempting to play Sunnis against Shia, all of that seems to have gone to the wayside. It seems like we're back at square one, which is good, right? It seems like the anti-imperialist forces in the Middle East are not isolated as they once were. Syria, the Syrian Arab Republic, is back in the Arab League. And it seems that at this point, it looks like at this point, the anti-imperialist forces have the upper hand in the world. That's not to say that imperialists obviously won't strike back and try to rebound. But at this point, globally speaking, not just in the Middle East region, Russia is winning. They've already won the war in Ukraine. China's economy is rising. Iran is no longer isolated in the Middle East. The Syrian Arab Republic has won. Socialism in Latin America is rising in Cuba and in Nicaragua and in Venezuela. And it looks, in Africa, many African countries are joining with the global anti-imperialist force. The anti-imperialist forces are winning at this point. Now, that doesn't mean there's not going to be setbacks, but overall, we're on the right side of history. Those of us who reject the global system of monopoly capitalism, who believe in a world that isn't centered around Wall Street and London, who reject a system that keeps the world poor so that Wall Street and London can stay rich, that is anti-growth, we're on the right side. Human beings want more than they already have. They want to grow. And country after country wants to see its people rise up out of poverty. We're on the right side of history in the Middle East and elsewhere. And gradually, our viewpoint, our view of multipolarity, our belief that, the countries around the world should be able to rise up and develop out of poverty, should be able to break free from a system that puts profits over people, but should have a rationally organized economy so that people can grow. We're going to win. And we're winning. Now, history doesn't move in a straight line, but we're winning. After the fall of the Soviet Union, they said, oh, the West is going to rule forever. There's going to be Western capitalism. It's the end of history. Western capitalism rules forever. Well, Hugo Chavez, Putin, Bolivarianism. I mean, things have changed since then a lot. And at this point, it's very clear we're on the winning team here. Even after the disaster of the 1990s, all the loss that happened, there's been a correction. The global communist movement has corrected itself. Now, 21st century socialism utilizes the strengths of the market. Now, there's much more respect for people of religious faith. Communism needed to correct itself. The fall of the Soviet Union was a disaster. Many, many people got hurt. But it also, it created a moment where the global communist movement could fix itself. Right? And there's been a real improvement. And if you look at 21st century socialism, Bolivarianism in Latin America, socialism with Chinese characteristics, if you look at the way socialist and anti-imperialist countries are operating now, we have, some of the, I always say the Soviet Union, it fell because it couldn't bend. So it broke, right? If a tree can't bend in the wind, it breaks, right? And, the Soviet Union couldn't bend, so it broke. Well, now many of the socialist countries around the world have learned how to bend. And now we've seen a reemergence of anti-imperialist forces. And ultimately, anti-imperialism is going to prevail. Africa is going in an anti-imperialist direction. Anti-imperialism is on the rise. The problem is that many of the people in the United States who consider themselves to be communist and anti-imperialist are still stuck in the past. They're still trying to do the Soviet thing. They're trying to LARP and pretend that they're Soviet-style communists, and they're out of touch with the global anti-imperialist movement. And that's what the Center for Political Innovation is here to change. We're here to say, no, we need to develop socialism with American characteristics. We need to develop an understanding of 21st century socialism to advance the American working class, to advance America as a country overall by getting rid of the imperialists and the monopolists. We need to do this in a way that is learning what the global anti-imperialist movement has learned. And that's what we got to say. So it's a long answer to your question, Gala, but I hope it's helpful. Who attacked first, the Soviets or the Mujahideen? Well, what happened was that in 1978 in Afghanistan, you had a monarchy that was neutral. It was neither pro-Soviet nor pro-US. It was neutral. It did business with the Soviets. And the Soviet Union had trained a lot of the military leaders of Afghanistan, right? And that a lot of the military leaders had gotten Soviet training and sympathized with the Soviets. And the pro-Soviet political party in Afghanistan was called the People's Democratic Party. And what happened was that there was a coup that basically the king of Afghanistan started trying, a pressure from the United States. Brzezinski now has revealed that, he set this up. The king that was neutral, that was friendly to both the USA and the Soviet Union, that allowed a lot of his military leaders to get Soviet training. He was pressured by the United States to start, and you're on the list, to start, purging his military and jailing and arresting all the pro-Soviet leaders of his military. But they ran the military. So in response to that happening, and in response to the Afghan king jailing many of the pro-Soviet leaders of his military, in response to that, the military rose up and overthrew the government and tore down the walls of the jail and freed a lot of the prisoners, et cetera. And that was called the Sour Revolution of 1978. And after the Sour Revolution, the People's Democratic Party that had been kind of forced to take power prematurely by the United States. That's why it was called the Afghan Trap by Brzezinski. Once they had prematurely taken power, they had to deal with the fact that Afghanistan, the countryside, was full of religious people who didn't agree with them, full of deeply religious Muslim folks in the countryside who did not agree with their very modern secular way of doing things. So the People's Democratic Party was in power, but it had a big section of the population that didn't support them. So among the rural folks in the countryside, there began an armed insurgency against the government, the People's Democratic Government. So then the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan asked the Soviet Union to send its military in to help them defeat this insurgency. So you're asking me who fired the first shot? The Soviets didn't arrive until the war had already started. The war began in the countryside with, Wahhabis, fanatical Muslims that were moving into the countryside to fight against the pro-Soviet government, the People's Democratic Party, and then the military of Afghanistan of the Soviet Union went in to protect them. And it makes sense. The Soviet Union didn't want, if the People's Democratic Party had been overthrown, then there would have been a fanatical, religious, Wahhabi, anti-communist government right on their border. There'd been a big center of Islamic terrorism right on their border, and that was apparently the strategy. They already had an Islamist insurgency against the Soviet Union in Chechnya. And the idea was that they would, spread Islamic terrorist groups all throughout the southern USSR and incite the Muslims of the USSR, who were deeply religious, against the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, it's interesting, they did a lot to try and appease the Muslims, right? You always hear these stories about, the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union, they say the Soviet Union that they forced Muslims to raise pigs, which was against their religion. That probably happened in some area, but in many areas of the Soviet Union, in many areas, you had extra efforts to accommodate them. For example, during the Stalin years, they had a medal. They had a special medal called Mother of the Soviet Union, which was for a woman who gave birth to more than 10 children, because they were trying to increase the population. If you had more than 10 children, you were a very honored, well-respected person. You were a mother of the Soviet Union. Well, they got rid of that in most of the USSR. But my understanding is that in some of the more Muslim republics, Kazakhstan, places like that, they maintained that medal because that was a cultural thing. It was very important to Muslims. They really believed in women having a lot of children. And that there were a lot of efforts to accommodate Muslims in the 70s and 80s, in the final years of the USSR. They did a lot to try and not alienate the Islamic population. But that was the strategy of the United States and Brzezinski, was to spread Islamic terrorism throughout the southern USSR. So the Soviet Union felt obligated to send its forces into Afghanistan to protect the People's Democratic Party. They felt obligated to, and we now know it was a trap. And Brzezinski bragged that he gave the Soviet Union their Vietnam. It was their strategy. They wanted to take the Vietnam War and how that had weakened U.S. imperialism, and they wanted to reverse it. They wanted to give the Soviet Union a Vietnam. So there you go. Thoughts on Cornel West running? I mean, he did drop out at this point. He's not on the Green Party ticket anymore. He's going to be a write-in candidate at this point, right? His whole reason, supposedly, for dropping the People's Party was that he was going to, have a ballot line with the Green Party. And now he's dropped the Green Party. So first it was he couldn't do the People's Party because they don't have a ballot line, even though they have a bunch of volunteers. They're ready to go out and build and get him on the ballot. His argument was, well, no, he's got to do the Green Party because they already have a ballot line. Well, the Green Party, they have a ballot line in a number of states, but they lose. I mean, they never make it. They get less than 1% every election. No one cares. So he would have a guaranteed ballot line with the Green Party. But now he's quit the Green Party. So he's basically a write-in candidate. And I agree with Nick Brana's analysis that Cornel West basically dropped out. He had his fight with Jimmy Dore. He made clear during that fight he considers Republicans to be more dangerous than Democrats, which is outrageous at this point. I mean, that's outrageous. I mean, the Democrats are marching us into World War III. The Democrats are jailing the Uhuru movement. They're jailing all the January 6 people. They're jailing Republicans. They're trying to throw Trump in jail to keep him from running for office. The Democrats are the main threat at this point. And I'm not a Republican. I'm not a conservative. I believe gay marriage should be legal. I believe in abortion being legal. I think abortion is probably wrong, but I don't think it should be outlawed because we don't have a religious government. I'm in favor of, a lot of liberal policies, but I'm just telling you that right now the Democrats are marching us toward woke fascism, marching us toward World War III. They're actively carrying out police state measures. The Republicans say a lot of bad things that I don't agree with, but in terms of the policies, the Democrats are more dangerous at this point. They just are. That is just, you can't deny that. That could change. We should be ready for that to change. But right now, Democrats are the main danger. But Cornel West doesn't think that. He thinks Republicans are the main danger. They're more dangerous because they're racist. And we saw that fight that Cornel West had with Jimmy Dore. So he made that clear. So, of course, he's dropping out. If you think the Republicans are the main danger, you have to support the Democrats. So you can't run against them in a national election and take votes away from them. So, yeah, Cornel West, he was running for president, and now he's a write-in candidate. It's symbolic, but it looks to me like Cornel West is his campaign is pretty much ended. That's what it looks like to me. All right. Imperialism is politicized sociopathy. That's interesting. I've used the term politicized sociopathy to describe like hard, like Ayn Rand objectivist libertarianism before, because it believes compassion is weakness, etc. Imperialism is an economic order where the world is dominated by trusts, cartels, and syndicates, an international financial oligarchy. Lenin described it in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. He described that situation, what imperialism is. It's capitalism in its monopolistic stage, holding back development around the world to maintain the monopoly of Western corporations and banks. That's what imperialism is. Imperialism does, and that this is, it's a big point. I talk about how Friedrich Nietzsche talked about the blonde beast and celebrated that imperialism was stripping the Christian moral pretenses away from European civilization and was getting people to be very much a might is right kind of mindset. It was leading to more of a sociopathic, primitive, criminal behavior. Nietzsche praised that in his writings. So perhaps that's what you're getting at. I can kind of see that. And I talk about that, chapter 4 of my book. I talk about philosophical irrationalism, the belief that there is no real truth, that the universe is defined by chaos and that might makes right. And that, that's a big part of where imperialism is going, is they are kind of fomenting a sociopathic mindset, postmodernism, etc. So I can see what you're getting at, Phil. I would agree with you. There you go. All right. What would happen to the Rage Against the War Machine movement once it de-escalated? Do we separate and fight with each other? Well, there's plenty of fighting that's going on even now. There's plenty of fighting that's going on even now. And you're on the list, Jacob. Plenty of fighting that's going on even now. I'm actually heartbroken. There's people that I've worked with that are part of the Rage Against the War Machine coalition that I've worked with for years and gotten a lot of shit for and all of that have turned against me all of a sudden for very stupid reasons, for very, very stupid reasons. And honestly, I'm pretty hurt by it. The Rage Against the War Machine coalition is the future. Angela McCurdle, who I streamed with, libertarian, I streamed with her on Sunday, amazing. Nick Brana, amazing. And those two are they're the big leaders of the Rage Against the War Machine coalition. But there's other forces involved, some of whom have been friendly to me and are hot and cold. And then there's one group, I'm not even going to name them, that has just turned against me and CPI in a really hurtful, vicious way that is totally unnecessary. And I've done a lot to help them, platformed them, promoted them, and then they just, whatever. And, it's going to make me think twice about groups that we partner with because, it's going to make me, I'm not going to make the mistakes I made with them again. But I'm going to make sure that anyone we partner with has an understanding that they need to reciprocate, and treat us with respect. I let this group recruit our people. And it was, and they spit in my face. And it's heartbreaking. And I don't know why they did this, but, I don't have time to worry about it. And I really don't have time to talk shit about it either, because whatever. And I hope maybe they'll change their minds at some point. But look, the Rage Against the War Machine coalition, anti-war, yes, but there is going to be an axis that emerges in the United States of people that think Russia and China are the future, that want to do business with Russia and China and not have a war with them, that want to restructure the United States to be more in line with 21st century socialism. That's going to happen. Even if the war danger leaves, that's going to happen. And the CPI is going to be an essential part of that, because there are two economies now in the world right now. There is the Atlanticist, imperialist economy of the West that is dying. And there is the new economy centered around Russia and China, centered around the Belt and Road, centered around the Eurasian Economic Union, centered around the axis of resistance in the Middle East, the Bolivarian alternative of Latin America. That new economy, you got the BRICS now. That new economy is emerging. And there's going to be people in the United States who realize that it would be in America's interest to be part of that economy, not to be hostile to it. And that's not going to go away just because the danger of war maybe goes away. That's not going to go away. And CPI is going to be a big part of that. And that's the future of America. And when 21st century socialism comes to America, it will be the American working class sitting at the center of an anti-monopoly coalition and aligning with the new economy that's emerging around the world, the post-imperialist economy that's emerging across the planet. And that's what's going to happen. So no, the material foundations of the Rage Against the War Machine coalition are not going to go away. Right? If you look at it, why are there so many libertarians and Republicans involved? Because a lot of lower level capitalists realize that it would be in their interest to do business with Russia and China, and they don't share the overall geostrategic agenda of the Eastern establishment, of the ultra monopolies. They realize that the future, economically speaking, the profits are to be made, et cetera, by joining this new alternative economy that's rising around the world. That's why. So there you go. All right. Hey, Caleb, have you had an opportunity to read Michael Hudson's Forgive Them Their Debts? It would make a good companion to Kautsky's Foundations of Christianity. I have not had an opportunity, but somebody gave a talk at a CPI conference. Oh, whoa. My camera's going everywhere there. I bumped the camera there. Someone gave a talk at our last CPI conference, the one in March that we did in DC, that was based on Michael Hudson's talk. And that, Michael Hudson's whole thing is about the debt industry and how that, basically leads to enslaving people. And Michael Hudson is a very important economist, and I should read it, Jacob. And I thank you for the recommendation. Jacob, you're a beloved member of our community, by the way. Jacob has been around CPI for a very long time. I believe you're a member. Maybe are you a member? I can't remember if you're a member. Sometimes you're more active than others, but you're a beloved member. You're from the South. You understand a lot of what we're getting at. And I've you've written some great reviews of my books and such, and I'm really glad to hear from you, Jacob. And Jacob is great. And I should read that book by Michael Hudson. I have a very positive opinion. Michael Hudson, I have been friendly with the son of Oliver Stone before, Sean Stone. And Sean Stone made a great documentary film for RT. I wonder if one can find it online anywhere. A great documentary film that he made. In that film, there's extensive interviews with Michael Hudson that are very good. So I hope that that film is available somewhere. It's a really great film that Sean Stone made about debt and about the U.S. economy. I think it's called A Century of War or something like that. It's very, very good. It's a very, very good documentary that Sean Stone made, and it includes extensive interviews with Michael Hudson. So I really enjoyed it. I really, really enjoyed the film. I really, really enjoyed the film. So all righty. Well, I think that's how we're going to end for this afternoon, but I'll be back at around 10 p.m. tonight. We're doing 2 streams a day, morning and evening. That's how we're doing it. There you go. Thanks, everybody. Thanks. Just keep doing them, doing different streams. Upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.